Good evening. My name is Bob DeGore. I'm going to be leading a discussion on setting expectations with America's youth. We're going to use two movies as a platform for our discussion. First one is Stand and Deliver, which is a real life story about Mr. Jaime Escalante, who left his well-paying job in the aerospace industry to become a teacher at East Garfield High School, which for those people that live in and around Los Angeles for decades, it's been just an awful high school. Low standards, bad neighborhood, and we'll get into a little bit of that in just a few moments. Mr. Escalante, almost by accident, well, he was originally signed on to teach computer sciences. That didn't work out. He ended up teaching basic mathematics to kids from the barrio. And then almost by accident, he realized that he really should be teaching these young people calculus. And so this is the chronicle of how he takes these underachieving, disadvantaged kids and turns them into AP scholars. The other movie, The Ultimate Choice, or The Ultimate Gift, excuse me, is a James Garner movie. It's a fictitious story, but it's about a truly affluent young man, the grandson of a Texas billionaire who really wasn't challenged at all. He had no expectations growing up. And so there's some parallels in some ways that we want to discuss. This has been kind of a tough session to put together. We had originally planned two 90-minute sessions, and trying to compress this into 90 minutes has been a little bit of a challenge. And on top of that, Hollywood has thrown several curveballs at me since I first presented this to the kids in our town. The format doesn't allow for me to run in my normal CD player. And I lent out CDs to the kids so they could see it earlier this year. It doesn't allow me to do screenshots when I want to take screenshots. And I've discovered in the last few days that there's some software changes that's gone on since I'm using it from Amazon Prime, and it doesn't allow me to link directly from the PowerPoint. So we're going to have to do some kludgy things to look at some of the video clips. So we're going to use some video clips that range from seconds to a minute or two in some cases to really talk about some of the important points. So I'm going to go ahead and share the first screen. And I as I'm doing that, I want to ask, here we go. I'm going to ask Rich, you must have seen a lot of movies over the years. Is there one movie that you would say is your absolute favorite?
There are a lot of different movies. I think one that I really liked, and it would probably never be made today, is Dr. Strangelove. It was war parody, and it covered a lot of grounds, but in a parody sense. And I don't think any of those type of movies will be made anymore,
And John, how about you? What do you say your favorite movie might be of all time?
Well, there's a number of them, but one that I've shared with my grandchildren, and I never get quite tired of seeing it, and it's starring Alec Guinness, and it's called The Lady Killers. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a British film, and I can still laugh and appreciate the humor. And fortunately, I'm another generation. I think I've indoctrinated. So,
okay. And Lynn, you have a favorite movie?
No, because I forget the names right after I watch them. So.
Well, these two movies that we're gonna examine tonight. Lynn, could you mute again, please?
Rich had a question.
I had one other. I know Lois's favorite movie is
Yes.
It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah.
The lessons that we actually have two DVDs, one the black and white, and then the colorized version of it. And at Christmas time, it is just quite a story, and we love to watch that.
It is a wonderful story. These two movies certainly don't fit into the scope of the movies that we just discussed in a lot of ways. It certainly isn't a movie of the scope of Out of Africa or Gone with the Wind or any of the other great box office successes over the years. However, I honestly can't tell you how many times I've watched Stand and Deliver because I think it is so important. I actually, this is almost like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, you know, how some of the campies can actually repeat the lines before they actually come up on the screen. I can almost do that with this movie. I've seen it so many times because I think it's so important. And I think that's why this conversation is really important too. As a footnote, before we get on to this first slide, in the first segment, we required the STEM leaders in our STEM camp for underprivileged kids to watch this movie this year before they actually were admitted into the program. And I asked them to watch it with their parents. It was really interesting to see how the young people, the 13 to 18-year-olds responded to this movie and how their parents responded. And I asked the parents to have a discussion with their kids about, you know, setting expectations. And so we're going to go through some of those observations perhaps tonight. So this first scene is what I call the expectation, and it runs a little over a minute. The school principal comes in and he explains to a faculty chair kind of meeting that they're going to lose their academic accreditation. And then you'll hear the math chair, who is a snarky, I shouldn't be that negative. She is the head of the math department, and she says we lack the resources. And then she also says you can't teach logarithms to illiterates. And I think that's where that kind of gets my goat from the very beginning, because it really is a malignant bias against the kids that, you know, if she can't get past that, maybe she shouldn't be teaching at that school. Then Mr. Escalante, who's brand new to the school, he says, well, I'm not doing everything I can to help us, you know, avoid this decreditation. And then the math teacher goes on to say, I'm sure Mr. Escalante has great intentions or good intentions, but he's only been here a few months. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to, again, we're going to have to struggle with the links here because for some reason, Hollywood is not letting me click on the links through PowerPoint. So Hollywood has made things a lot more difficult than when I first showed this to the kids back in May. So, it's what you heard him say, or may have heard him say, but you couldn't see, is that students rise to the level of expectations. So, and that I want to talk a little bit about the kids that are in a rough neighborhood. Parents are poor, a lot of them are immigrants, and then contrast that to the movie, The Ultimate Gift. And this is what I call the affluent contrast. And in this scene that we can't watch, it talks about toxic, uncaring relationships where the grandfather, James Gardner, is a Texas oil billionaire, and he passes away. And he gathers all of his many children and grandchildren, and they read his will. And ultimately, they're pretty snarky. They expect a lot of money, and the old man isn't having any of their being overprivileged. Actually, that was probably his fault in a lot of ways, but they were overprivileged, and they were just waiting for the old guy to kick the bucket so they could inherit millions and millions of dollars. So ultimately, they get around to all of the kids. They were in their middle age, and they get around to one grandson. Can you see that? No, you can see that. Well, I can't on this one, but I usually can. So anyway, let me talk through this. So anyway, so the grandfather finally says, when in a video, you're the family member that I feel I hurt the most. The only way I can make it up to you is to give you nothing. And then he gives this young man a series of things that he needs to do. He doesn't know what it is, but if you fail in any way, it's all over and you get absolutely nothing. Several scenes after that, Jason's talking to his sleazy girlfriend, who's used to fast cars and penthouses and really expensive dinners out and stuff like that. He says, well, I'm not sure exactly what my grandfather's given me, and probably it's going to be nothing, but at least I've got my trust fund. Worst case scenario, I can live off my mom. And a sleazy girlfriend says, well, try to get as much as you can out of your grandfather. My gosh, what if you actually have to get a job in the future? And so what we saw in the first movie is these kids are just struggling just to get by. Parents are struggling to work multiple jobs, to put food on the table. Education isn't a real priority. And then this Jason, his grandson, has got everything pretty much given to him. And it's what the term I use, affluent neglect. So we've got two contrasting family situations and cultures. So I guess the first questions that we would have asked if we'd watched the videos is, how are low expectations of malignant bias and malignant neglect interconnected? Anybody want to volunteer an answer for that? How are the low expectations of malignant bias and malignant neglect interconnected?
Rich.
Rich.
I think the way they're connected is both people will turn out to be terrible in the end because they never learned any standards, and that's the terrible part of it.
Yeah, and malignant bias is
Malignant bias is almost a institutional or cultural bias, whereas malignant neglect is really family-based in a lot of ways. Lynn, you were about to say something?
Well, yeah, to me, there's a similarity that in both cases, there's literally no expectations for these young people.
Mm-hmm.
So they're basically rising up to that expectation of nothing. So in a way, with the Jaime Escalante example, he comes in as a teacher who wants to believe in his students. He must be a new teacher, and wants to help them raise themselves up through education and learning something that's kind of hard. So,
Yeah.
And then having had the benefit of seeing that other movie too, I think the grandfather was trying to do really the very same thing.
Yeah, yeah. John, as an educator, how have you observed malignant bias or malignant neglect?
Well, I'm thinking
over
of
the years?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that question specifically, but this is an anecdote that might fit. My freshman year in college, I volunteered to teach pretty much, in fact, all Black students in a predominantly African-American neighborhood in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is my hometown. And I had about 12 students sitting around a table, and they were all trying to read from Dick and Jane. I'm sure you're familiar with those.
Yeah.
Those textbooks. I certainly remember them. Dick saw Jane, Jane saw Dick, and then there was Jeff. Well, there was a dog and there was a cat. Repetitive language over and over again, and boring as hell. And I was doing what I was expected to do among all of our volunteers, which was to keep drilling them on this. And then I decided to see if I couldn't take a different tack. And I brought along, I guess, to the second or third session, I brought along a copy of Rudyard Kipling's book short story called Rikki Tikki Tavi, which you may remember. It's about a mongoose and a mongoose that can chase and eat a cobra. And when I started reading this, I was more surprised than I should have expected it. But all of a sudden, these students were just riveted. I started reading the story, and their attention span all of a sudden sparked up. And what I did was then, after I get to an exciting part, I just stop. And they'd say, well, Mr. Miller, please read on. I'd pass the book to the student to my right, said, why don't you try to read it? Well, they stumbled. Of course, there was a lot of words that are not familiar to them. this is a story about India after all. Places like words like bungalow and things like that, they didn't know what they meant. But they were so motivated to hear more that they participated. They really tried. They wanted to hear this story and they wanted to read it themselves. And if someone got stuck, I would say, well, pass it to someone else. We'll just go around the table. And there was such a desire to please themselves and obviously to please me, because the story was so exciting, about a cobra coming to the dining room table and the father saying, everybody stand still. And you should have seen those kids stand still. And that was a revelation to me that some books are primarily meant to exercise in dullness and by repetition somehow educate. But something that is exciting, something that is, even if it's in a different culture such as India, with an exciting action, a plot, that can motivate people to really want to try. And I had to, my mentor, the teacher told me well, I had to go back to the rote things, and I did. And I made the prize for good attendance, not only good attendance, but also good participation. And that would be on Friday. And I would read some more of Rikki Tikki Tavi. And it was wonderful. I also had to take them out for outings and so on. But it was a wonderful revelation of low expectations giving low results and higher expectations, even with a text that's a good bit beyond their reach, the desire to read.
And it gets back to what Mr. Escante was really talking about, is that, if you challenge young people, the good ones are going to always rise to the level of expectations. There's another thing you bring up here too, is that achievement becomes infectious, or can. And in the movie, in Stand and Deliver, there is peer pressure on the streets to kind of comply with gang culture.
Mhm.
And as some of these young people start to get successful in the mathematics program, they've got to kind of hide the fact that they're AP scholars
Uh-huh.
from the folks out on the street. So
From peer contempt or something like that.
yeah, exactly. And so I think that as I'm in and out of high schools, I think there's a bit of that we see that we could certainly harness. Parents and teachers and school district could really harness a little bit more of that. So, and this you're about to say something, Lynn?
Yeah, I think it goes a little further than that though, because it's not every kid accepts the challenge. For sort of like what you're talking about, Bob, in LA, they had a significant pushback from all their, I wouldn't say their friends, but from their social grouping to not be successful. And in the gift, yes, there is an excitement to learning. And I guess the question then from a societal point of view is, how do you keep kids from losing that? How do you have greater influence on the positive side of learning and achieving than all the negative things that maybe from home or from their friends that cause kids to be embarrassed when they succeed, or to keep it quiet. I mean, other than what some of the parents in this community have done of sending their kids, paying a lot of money to send their kids to schools where excellence is the norm, and everybody competes to be top in their class or to do well. How do you get that in a public school system, for example?
Yeah, I wonder, Lynn, whether, and Bob, the emphasis on individual success, as opposed to something that might be where it was students were more engaged in a collective sharing of a task.
Yeah, like in your case where if they lived up to the, if they did what they were supposed to in class on Monday through Thursday, then they all got that reward of getting to listen to the story they wanted to listen to.
But I was thinking more of having students work with each other as opposed to this emphasis on the individual. The individual has to have the right answer, and that's where your grade comes from, as opposed to something more fluid where there's a project for a small class or even a large class or divided up where they have to work with each other, and the person who is stronger helps the weaker one learns from a peer. And there could be some benefits from that aside from this highly individualized effort.
That has been something that's been done in schools for years now, but the experience that I remember most is that of having a group of kids who didn't really want to do any work, who would hang on to the shirts, your shirt, and while you did all the work, kind of a thing. And how as a teacher could you alleviate that and make it so that it has, as you said, and I know I remember my parents talking about this as teachers at the elementary school level, about that there's always, yes, some kids will not be challenged at that level, but they try and get them to help the others catch up. But that's one thing, but the other of working together as teams or as groups, I think business has found that doesn't always work really well. Rich?
On me.
Bob, it sounds a little bit like what the experience you had in the summer STEM camp, where some of the kids started helping the other kids, and it's infectious. And it's like, can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, I think I can kind of circle back to that example, and also, Lynn, can you mute again, please? And also circle back to the leadership, the intrinsic leadership that Mr. Escalante had.
Mm-hmm.
He created a culture inside of his classroom that kind of spoke to what Lynn and John talked about, in that it became a collective effort. He made them all suffer, so they shared the suffering. And in the case of the STEM camp, we on several levels. When things didn't go according to plan, for example, the first day because of COVID and those sorts of things, it was interesting to see the best and I think most well-rounded young people jumped into the breach and helped the people who were struggling. And for the adult in the room, it was really hard for me not to jump in and fix things. And it was interesting that they learned by the end of the week. They called it a leadership laboratory, but by the end of the week, they really learned how they could cooperate. There's a credo at the Naval Academy, and it goes, you got to navigate to graduate, but more importantly, you have to cooperate to graduate. And I think it goes back to what John talks about too, is that, there are instances when we see someone not doing as well as they could, that you need to jump in and help out. So
but that's leadership. That's different from what we're talking about, isn't it?
A little bit, yeah.
We're talking about how do we set, ultimately we're talking about how do you create realistic expectations so that our youth who will be leading the country in the next generation are going to know how to do that, or going to be willing to do that.
There's a credo that we've used for the 5 years we've been doing the STEM camp, and it's improvise, adapt, and overcome. And they understand that mantra all along. It becomes an expectation that if something isn't going according to plan, they need to think in that way. And there's a slide I have in here later on that talks a little bit about, here it is. So here we see a mama bear and a cub. And she says to the people looking on, what are you looking at? I'm teaching him how to swim. Well, I think this is what I call the deep end expectation. There's a scene in the movie where there's a fellow up at the board, you know, and we've all been through that. You know, you've been in integral mathematics or algebra or differential equations. You're up at the board, and you can't quite get that problem. Everybody's staring at you. And this one fellow who only scored a 3 on his AP exam, ultimately from the barrio, he only got a 3, which is a passing score, by the way. He says, I just can't do it. I have to quit. You know, for the sake of the class, I'm dragging everybody down. And ultimately, Mr. Escalante says, do you want me to do it for you? And the student says, yes. And Mr. Escalante says, you're supposed to say no. And so I think this deep end expectation, you know, kind of speaks to what Lynn talked about too, is that, you know, leadership and expectations, they kind of go hand in hand in some ways. And so this is in STEM camp throughout. I let the kids struggle a bit often. And then if I need to throw in a lifeline, I was there to do it. But I think they learn a little bit better when they struggle with it. Instead of, like, you know, Mr. Escalante showing you how to do a mathematics problem, struggle with it, figure it out, figure out how to derive that equation, and you'll have it forever. So does that make sense?
Yes. And sometimes you might find a student who could solve the equation in a way that works, but it's in a different way.
Precisely. You know, and it's a way of thinking. And I think that, you know, there is, I just saw another slide here. We're going to be good jumping all over here. So this isn't just about math. This is a movie about mathematics, but it really isn't. So in this I call the no free ride expectation. Okay. And Mr. Escalante says we'll begin each class with a quiz. And you can hear the kids groan. And he says, there will be no free ride and no excuses, none. You already have 2 strikes against you. There are some people in this world who will assume that you know less than they do because of your name and your complexion. And then he finishes up the scene by saying, math is the great equalizer. For me, that's a really personal statement. But in this next slide, I think, here, no, that's not it. Sorry. There it is. So, so it really is. It isn't. Math is the vehicle by which they tell the story in this movie, but it really isn't just about math. It could be about literature, like in John's class in Pittsburgh. It could be about a lot of things that we've experienced in life. But the metaphor really is that they need to work hard. They need to make a goal and work hard. And so Mr. Escalante sets expectations for personal accountability. And I think that's what he's saying is, you know, don't play this victim stuff, because I'm not going to accept that in my classroom. And we're going to see the result of that at the end of this slide deck here, and certainly at the end of the movie. I'll send the link over to you so you can take a look at the movie if you want to see it. And Lynn has something to say.
I was just thinking that we always hear there are teachers that manage to accomplish that. John did in that particular class. But not every teacher is going to be able to do that with every class. It takes a certain type of teacher, I think. And so I'm not sure. Yes, this is an interesting example, but when you look at the larger picture of this, is it really about teachers, or is it really about parents and parents setting that example? John?
Observation here, Mr. Escalante, unlike my experience, really lays it on the line about you are more than the expectations of your color or race or whatever that was. I mean, he didn't hold that card back. And that perhaps brings another factor into this, that these students maybe know that there is or have experienced teaching which assumes that they can't do anything. And so they buy into the model. But he really laid it down in a way that I would be, I'd be not afraid to, but that being that direct, and you're going to have to struggle because you can do more than you think or what your teachers have thought about you.
Well, maybe that created a sense of believability that the kids recognized, so they trusted him.
Exactly. They've seen it before. Those students know what he's talking about.
We talked a little bit about that as we get further onto this slide deck too. Lynn, could you mute again, please?
Yeah, I just wanted to say though, even here in our own local area, I think, now, I haven't seen this personally, but I wonder how the Waterman kids are treated, for example, or the kids on the other side of the tracks in St. Michael's. There are I'm sure teachers all want to see success among the kids, but I know of at least one case where every time they turned around, this kid was sent to the principal's office to sit because he was distracting kids in the class. And well, yes, that's an issue, but do we do a disservice to kids by having, putting them on drugs for ADD or sending them out to sit in the hallway instead of participating in the class? That's a hard thing to grapple with.
I think teaching is an honorable profession. I mean, incredibly honorable. In fact, I think that society's greatest obligation is to educate the next generation. I really believe that. And I think that, that at least in public schools, I'm in and out of private and public schools all the time, but I think public school teachers unfortunately have to tippy-toe around being diplomatic sometimes. Whereas I help with two different disciplines, one in geopolitics, and also in the sciences. And I often hear teachers say, wow, you said something that I can't say. There are times when I get in their face. You haven't done a homework assignment. I'm gonna climb up your knickers and we're gonna talk about it. And it's the same way at the Naval Academy. Heaven forbid you haven't done your homework assignment the night before. The professor finds out like that fast because the class sizes are less than 9 per class.
So that's an issue of not even, that goes beyond living up to expectations. It's creating a obligation of the kids that you're here to learn and I'm here to teach.
Absolutely.
What are you thinking, John?
I'm thinking of I used to teach in a private high school, K through 12. I taught in the upper school. I had a very bright student, and most of the students in this school were white. It's changed considerably since I was there. But this one student had a full ride scholarship, and her parents were so proud of her. They were immigrant family, working in the steel mill industry. And the mother was so proud of her, she would tell people about their daughter. And the daughter confided in me one time that her mother didn't understand what it meant for her to study. The mother expected her to help prepare the meal, to take care of the younger children, to clean up the dishes, to help her mom and all of those things. And when that was all done, it was time to go to bed. Now, this was a 9th grader. She didn't have, well, she had to surreptitiously study with a light in her own room if she had a room of her own. And she confided in me about this, and I thought that was an interesting phenomenon. She was very bright, and she did very well, but to accomplish that, she had to go against the expectations of her mother in particular.
That's
who
an
was so proud
interesting
of her.
point because that was brought up in that movie where there was at least one young lady that had to, she still had all the expectations of helping around the home, and that, and everything else that was expected of the oldest daughter, I guess.
Yes.
And she had to and it was very difficult for her to find a place to study. Now contrast that with the rich kid in this story who probably didn't have time to study because he was so busy being a gadfly and doing all those social things that, running around and showing all his friends how important he was because he had the fancy car and the prettiest girl in the school, kind of a thing.
I think the parental expectation is a really important one. There's another scene, I know there's the scene that Lynn's talking about, but there's another one in there where this young lady, really bright young lady, AP Calculus, and she tells Mr. Esconti that she's going to have to drop that class because they're taking 2 math classes a day. They're coming in an hour early. They're studying on an hour after school, and they're like varsity athletes. And on Saturday, I mean, that's how he's really disciplined these kids. And the young lady comes into class. She says, "I'm just going to have to drop it. My father wants me to work in the family restaurant."
Right.
And so the next scene, you see Mr. Esconte and his wife there having dinner at this Mexican restaurant in East LA. And they have a talk with the father. And the father says, "Look, all my daughters work here. This is a family business. And it's just the way it is. She can help make income for the family." And Mr. Escalante says, "Well, has your daughter shared with you that she plans to go to medical school?"
Mhm.
And the father says, "Sorry, that's the way it's going to have to be. She's got, she has the after school shift here, and we can't afford to have her, studying." Ultimately, you see in a scene later on when she takes her SAT exam that she finishes up early, and not because she finished the exam, but she had a scholarship interview that she had to go to. So she finishes early, way early before everybody else. And we're all familiar on this call that a 5 is a perfect score on an AP exam. 4 is really, really, really good, and 3 is passing. Well, this young lady who finished 45 minutes earlier, so still got a 4 on her AP calculus. And so ultimately, the father did allow her to come back. There were a lot of circumstances beyond that. But I think parental expectations go a long way, especially in underprivileged neighborhoods. Rich?
I had a Chinese American coworker that a very good friend of mine, and talk about parental expectations. He said, and we were on him very close, he said, every Chinese American parent is a tiger mom. From that book that, that pushing the child, they always pushed. Even later in life, he would say he's in 35, 40, and she's looking at the clock. "Don't you think it's time you should go to work now?" It's like, but there wasn't a point where she could just let loose.
Yeah. So I'm trying to find a slide here. Let's see. Where am I going? Oh, should be going up here. So Rich sent over an article by Carrie Ingraham, and it's a really interesting story about how we seem to be underperforming a lot of, here in the United States, underperforming places like China, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Japan. Ooh, notice how so many of those are Asian countries. And at the tail end, in the last paragraph, Carrie talks about, she quotes George W. Bush, who coined a phrase, "the soft bigotry of low expectations." And I think that's kind of what I was trying to find the slide where Mr. Escalante referred to Yeah, in fact, racism of low expectations exists in the barrio. And so, that kind of goes back, a lot of this is cultural too. There are low expectations and high expectations depending upon, where you come from. There was I always like to refer to this statistic. I think one of the most amazing statistics in all of baseball is that, as I recall, Ty Cobb played in the major leagues. He was a player and a player manager for 23 years. And he only struck out 23 times, no, 36 times, excuse me, 36 times. Now, a lot of players these days, they strike out that many times in the first month, let alone over nearly 2.5 decades. But what's even more interesting is that perhaps over 2 decades ago, the incoming class at Harvard saw 19% of their class as Korean Americans. 19%, 1 in 5. Considering that they are, if Asians in general are at the time were probably 2 to 3% at most of our population, and to see something so disproportionate, it really said something about, the tiger moms in those Korean American neighborhoods in this country. So that's kind of, we talked a little bit about this too, or Lynn alluded to this too, is that, Red, who's the grandfather, was giving some gifts or that were really expectations or challenge that his grandson, Jason, never received growing up. And I want to come, so there's a whole scene here where, so this young fellow gets tasked by his grandfather to do a couple things, hoping that he might sort of kind of get some sort of inheritance. This young fellow doesn't know what it is, but he might get a car, might get a penthouse, might get millions of dollars, might get, who knows. And the first thing, he shows up and he goes to, he flies in from, I guess, Los Angeles into Houston. And one of the grandfather's old ranching buddies picks him up and takes him out to his farm. Well, at the airport, he says, "You don't look like you've worked a day in your life." And they get to this old man's house. It's a really nice house, but not resplendent like a mansion in Beverly Hills. And they get out of the car, and this old friend says, "Dinner's in an hour, and we get up at no, he said breakfast is at 0500.
Mhm.
And in response to that, this young fellow is expecting the gift right away. He says, "Aren't you forgetting something?" Rather condescendingly, "Aren't you forgetting something? The gift." And so this young man's lamenting he can't get a cell site, he can't do anything. He buries his head underneath the pillow. He's just really fretting that this is just this assignment, this challenge by grandpa really sucks. Well, he overslept the next morning, and at 5:25, after breakfast was finished, this rancher friend of his grandfather comes in and says, "Breakfast is over. We're going out to your job site."
Hmm.
And this young fellow, who affluent and all that stuff, he rolls back over. And Gus, who's the friend, comes back in with a cattle prod and stings him on the butt. And so that's another kind of expectation. Sometimes you've got to motivate people in certain ways. So we talked a little bit about that. What about motivating methods like cattle prods? I think sometimes there are different ways we need to kind of push people into accepting their expectations. And we have any examples where we've had to kind of goad people along, especially John, during your teaching career? Have you seen how you've got to?
Yes. Before I answer that, if you take the 19th century public school, beatings were a ritual of a horrendous kind. Thank God those are gone, maybe totally. But trying to encourage students who have means and are in a private school and not on scholarship, that's hard. my feeling, because the classes were small, it's pretty hard to avoid any of the teacher in high school, any of the teachers' expectations. It's pretty hard to hide. And not humiliating students has never was a prod that I would use, but would be more wanting to talk to them after class. What's up? You're not, I can just tell from the assignment that you wrote overnight or the paper, you haven't really worried it enough. I love that phrase. You did it, it's done, you handed it in, but you didn't really proof it. You didn't read it aloud, a whole series of things that you could do to find out whether you've done a good job. And sometimes to ask them point blank, how much time did you spend on this? And how much did you worry it? And sometimes the truth will out. And that kind of individual attention can be a motivator. Mm-hmm. And I found it a private way to work around it. My feeling was in a small class like that, if I'm teaching the Iliad or the Odyssey or a novel, I may not, or a Shakespeare play, I may not, these students may never read a Shakespeare play again in their life until maybe they come to Chesapeake Forum. But I felt my duty was I have got to give this, I've got to teach this in the very best way I possibly can. I owe it sort of to myself. And if they never take it again, or if they do, maybe they'll remember John Miller from way back. So I tried to motivate them. And sometimes if a paper came in, I would say, nope, why don't you just exchange the paper with someone next to you and have that student grade it themselves and you talk about it. That took a little bit of doing because no one wanted to say something negative about a fellow classmate. But once that was over, it did open things up. So I found beatings and floggings, no, but independent guidance because I cared, and that helps.
I see a lot of college application essays, not from the institution that I represent, but a lot of others. You know, kids that are in the STEM camp, they come to me and ask for some help, and so I say, you know, send them on, send your essays over. I'll take a look at them, and I mark them up. Mm-hmm. Here, red pen. I mark them up. I send them back, and I think sometimes it isn't negative, but it's like they know they don't want to go through that markup again, and so that becomes a bit of a motivation. And I ask a lot of questions instead of saying, you know, don't do this or that sort of thing. I ask them, why did you say that? How could you say that better? And things like that. So I think that there are a lot of ways you can motivate. And you know, this kind of gets back to, and again, I'm not a teacher, never have been, but it goes back to what Tommy Lasorda answered in an interview many decades ago. He was a World Hall of Fame manager for the Los Angeles Dodgers. This reporter asked him one time, so, Mr. Lasorda, describe your leadership style. And at the time, the Major League rosters had 26 players on each team. And Mr. Lasorda came back and said, I don't have a single leadership style. I have 26 leadership styles. And I think a lot of times you have to do that in a classroom too, or you have to do these are all individuals. You just can't put them into one big bucket and figure out that that's how it's going to work.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's an interesting point, and I think it really resonates with from a teaching perspective. But you know, because you have a classroom full of individuals, and it's, you know, just like I learned training horses, they're all different, and you had to have a big bag of tricks to be able to go back to once in a while to, well, that didn't work. Let's see, maybe this will help. But it's something that you said earlier struck me, and that was that I know as a consultant that my goal has always been to you know, the job isn't done until my clients are happy, and happy to the point where I know they're going to come back and ask me to do something else for them. And I'm wondering if it is, isn't there a way that you can relate that to expectations? That if a kid, for example, doesn't live up to your expectations, you're not going to offer to help them again, or you're not going to offer them the prize position on the team, or the and it somehow there seems like there's a disconnect that they should get it because they're showing up, and not that they're working for it. Rich, you're being awfully quiet. What do you think of that? Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. One thing doesn't work for everybody. I think you've got certain people, you absolutely have to use the foot in the derriere, and others, the gentle persuasion, and
I know with a kid, like Bob must have been like, all he had to do was say, "Oh no, you won't be able to do that."
yeah.
And then he'd be spending the rest of the semester proving you wrong.
I think there's something to be said about that. I think Mr. Esconti, they did that from time to time too. He would kind of challenge his kids to say, well, only losers give up and things like that, and probably some kind of language that we can't say in a lot of schools in America today. And again, you got to remember this is back in the early, well, he was a teacher at Garfield through the 1980s. So things have really changed a bit. Yes.
So just one thing I remember doing again with senior English in high school was if we were doing, let's say, King Lear, and one of my favorite plays, I would have 3 students each period. I'd eventually go through the whole 12 if I had. Now those are absurdly small numbers, or 15. And they would have to sit in the front of the class. I'd sit in the back, and they would have to teach it. Now that turned the tables. Some of them were really good at it. Others stumbled, or partially, but they're just not used to standing up and being and lecturing or speaking to their peers, or with your teacher in the back room. But it was a really interesting exercise. And I did it after people got used to that, students got used to that. I tried it more often to turn the tables, to sit in the back of the room and see what they could do. Some of them were amazing. I don't think they ever thought they could do it. And those that weren't amazing, they were intrigued by what the ones that did. They became sort of heroes. And when it worked, I just remember walking on air after the class and saying, "Good Lord, look at that." I was as happy as I think they were.
Well, that sounds like what Bob's next slide. Oops, I helped Bob just moves his slide. So, this whole idea of setting expectations for personal accountability. So you told them they were going to be doing it. They had to be ready to do it. And if they knew that if they didn't do it well, they wouldn't be meeting your expectations or their classmates' expectations. That gets back to the whole idea that John alluded to earlier, though, of working in groups. So how does a teacher make sure that everyone is holding their end of the bargain up when they've got group thinking going on? What do you think, John?
I'm thinking about that. I think one of the directives you could give is if there's someone in that group of 3 is not speaking up, it behooves the other 2 to say to Mary or Bill, "You haven't said anything yet. What do you have to say?" And then stop until that person says something. It's like the St. John's seminar that I remember sitting in on over in Annapolis, and the tutor would come in and they'd be discussing a major work, and the tutor would sit there because it was made clear earlier on that this is the student's responsibility. And I remember breaking into a sort of sweat as I was an observer. And the tutor said nothing for 15 minutes. And then one student had something to say, and then another one. I don't think I would be capable of that vacuum where I'm supposed to do something and I'm just sitting there. But boy, what a motivator that is.
In some of the classes I participate in the high school classes, I think I'm getting a lot of feedback, sorry. There are times when I'll ask a tough question, like in a geopolitical class. I'll ask a tough question and I will put my hand up and I'll take a step backwards. And I will say, who has the first question? And I wait. And invariably, somebody will be that first one. And then the dam breaks.
Yes.
But, there are different techniques that we use to get to motivate people to participate. And speaking of other expectations, there's a scene in here where the kids have been exposed to calculus. No, they've been exposed to pre-calculus, I should call it that. And one of the fellows who's struggling with the class said, like, well, how can we put two and two together? How can we use this math really? And they really didn't know what they didn't know. Ultimately, Mr. Escalante takes him to the computer lab where he used to work for this aerospace industry. And there's a fellow, so they're going around. They got punch cards. They've got pages and pages of printouts, of computer printouts and stuff like that. And one of the kids goes up behind this fellow and he looks into the screen and he asks this scientist, he says, "What kind of math is this?" And the scientist says, "It's calculus." And Mr. Escalante says, "You'll see it or you'll get it in college." And that's when the light went on. And so they actually went on this field trip. And this gets back to what I like to say, young people don't know what they don't know. And so sometimes we have to expose them to things so that we can set new and refreshing expectations for them. And so
we can't see the screen.
You can't see this?
No, there's a thing up there that you don't have on your screen.
Oh, that's weird.
This one says field trip. Imagine this expectation. That's the screen I see.
Oh, I'm not. Yeah, I can't see that.
I see
it, Rich.
I see it.
Yeah.
You do? Oh.
Lynn, I guess you're just special.
I guess. Wow.
She's having trouble with her computer this week.
Yeah.
But you can see the bus. So.
Oh, look, I can move it around.
Oh.
That shouldn't be. Are you guys seeing that moving around?
No.
No, it's not
Oh.
moving. It's static.
Oh, okay.
Oh, she's.
Now there's a new one with a question mark on the upper left.
Yeah. Huh.
So this young fellow says, "This stuff I didn't use bad grammar." I'm quoting this young fellow. He says, "This stuff don't make sense unless you show us how it works in the real world."
Hmm.
And so, how does that apply? Rich, did you ever have interns that came to your company?
But and not only that, when I went to Virginia Tech, I went through a co-op program, which is you go to school on a quarter basis in that time, and you would alternate going to school for one quarter and then going in industry for another quarter. You wind up graduating with 7 quarters of work, and you get an awful lot of experience. And one of the key factors that people learned, it's you don't know what you don't know. Many of the people decided that they didn't want to be that kind of engineer because they found out what it was, because nothing in their prior experience will tell them what it's like. And I have to say, for my own son, it's like, I knew exactly what I wanted to be when I went to college, an engineer, and I knew about it, and I went to co-op, but my son didn't know what he wanted to do. And you go into class and guidance counselor, are you kidding me? They know less than anybody else does. And, so they get discouraged from that. And I'll just tell one little story. The deciding factor, okay, after a couple of years at University of Maryland, he said, no, I can't, it doesn't make any. So he dropped down and he went to work at a warehouse moving furniture. And it was the godsend. After about 3 or 4 months of that, he said, I'm going back to college. You know, it was the deciding, because he had seen what the alternative, and he didn't like that at all. And so now he was dedicated to go back. And I think there's an awful lot of kids graduating from high school that have no clue as to what they want to do or what even it entails. You know, that's a real problem.
So how do we as families, schools, and culture encourage kids to start thinking in those terms? What do you want to do? You can always change your mind, but I see too many high school kids who they hit graduation day from high school, and they don't know what they're going to do next week.
Yeah. You know, it helps to pose the question, what is your passion? Kind of early on, what are you really good at? Not what do you want to do, but answer, what are you really good at? What do you really like doing? And to mesh that with, or even to, what did you do during your summer vacation? And so nothing, I just pumped gas. Well, probe that a little bit. What else did it take to pump gas? What are you were dealing with? Well, I was dealing with the public, had to make change. I had to be polite. I had to solve problems. I thought, wow, there you begin to get a resume here. I don't just say I just did as if that was worthless. So that
I like the passion idea though. I used that one on a nephew.
Yeah.
That he used to come to the ranch every break he had from school. He loved being around the horses, and finally he was coming to the end, and he was of his high school years, and was going to be starting college. And I one night over at the dinner table, I said, "Well, Kenny, what are you passionate about? What do you want to do that'll make you want to get up every morning? Because you know, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much money you make in the world. It matters what you do in the world." And he ended up going to Montana. He went to a community college up there, and got a job at a ranch. And so he lived literally, I think he lived in a stall, and converted stall, through the winter with his dog. and now he's a rancher with his own herd, and has realized, he has learned how important math was to be able to figure out how to make ends meet. And he's learned all kinds of things, but at the end of the day, he did what he was passionate about, which is nice to see. Yes.
I like to use this phrase. Lynn, could you?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, my mic picks up Lynn's speaker, but with the high school kids that I work with, I use a phrase often that kind of helps me push them a little bit. And it goes something like this. So many people describe themselves by the phrase, they are what they do. Self-actualized people do who they are. They do who they are. So with the biomed kids, I push them into parts of medical science that they wouldn't get in a normal high school curriculum. And I have them talking to scientists all over the country. And we even hooked up some of the kids with some scientists in Europe, and get them thinking about stuff that isn't in textbooks. And I think, by getting them outside of their comfort zones, they learn a little bit more. And it gets back to a phrase we've used a couple of times this evening about they don't know what they don't know what they don't know, or and I think it's important to expose kids to those sorts of things. We are down to just a few minutes, and despite the fact that we had some hiccups with running the videos tonight, I think this has turned out to be, for me, an enlightening discussion.
For me too, Bob.
I want to go
I still keep coming back though to the bottom line. I guess I'm a bottom line kind of a person.
Yeah.
But so it obviously you aren't going to solve the problem in one discussion.
Mhm.
But and there is a difference, I think, between being in the public schools versus the private schools for obvious differences, good and bad. But how can we as residents, as the people who are in the 65 plus age group who are going to be turning the reins over to other people much younger than us, I have to admit, not that I want to admit, how do we make sure, how do we guide the future of our country, the expectations, what do we do?
What can we volunteer as tutors?
Yeah.
We can, but does a senior make as much of an impact? And I would have to say, Bob's older than I am, and I see him make an impact every day with the kids that he works with. And I'm somewhat jealous sometimes because he's the end of the day, he's going to die, and there'll be people who show up at his funeral going, "Wow, Mr. DeGore was a great guy, and he helped me do this."
Well, look at CASA, for example. You've got children who court appointed to people, adults, for whom there is a relationship. And I think that's a reciprocal one. And it's court appointed, of course, as opposed to volunteer, but that's an important role that someone cares.
And there've been studies done in some of the Scandinavian countries, I believe, who have where they have moved students into senior living environments where there is that reciprocal give and take of a relationship that has become a part of life. And in today's environment, where so many kids don't have a dad at home, or maybe their mom is never home because she's working 3 jobs to make ends meet, that can be a really important role that seniors can take.
I think that
maybe we should look at that.
There's another thing. Another thing that I try to do too. So I work with an admissions department for one institution. I'm in and out of high schools. I do a lot of things. I run a STEM camp for underprivileged kids. Actually, I don't. The kids do. And one of the things that I try to do is lead by example. I'm the crazy old guy that rides his bicycle instead of taking a car. Because so many kids are not physically fit, so if they can see an old guy like me doing something, why can't they do it? And I challenge them to, in many instances, I tell young people that I help get into tier 1 universities or service academies, I tell them, I expect you to do what I do someday. When you're old and not so great like me, I expect you to do these sorts of things. So we set some expectations that, and this is kind of what Mr. Escalante does in the movie too. It turns out that he's working 6 days a week with this calculus program. He's volunteering at a local community college, and he's doing some other tutoring. And he ultimately has a heart attack. And the day after his heart attack, he's back in the classroom, and the kids were like terrified. And he says, "This is where I belong." So I think sometimes it really takes, as so many military officers or flag officers say, you need to lead from the front. And sometimes it's a leading by example that makes a big difference. As we wrap up here, we only have less than 10 minutes, but I think that both of these movies, and we didn't really talk much about the second movie a lot, but it really gets back to one of my favorite graphics, which is this old Greek mythology figure, Sisyphus, who pushes a irregular boulder up a hill. And he's destined to do this for all eternity. Thing is, he has to push it up. When he gets near the top, it slips back down. He's got to keep doing it. So it's an exercise in futility. And so the question would be, in a contemporary sense, is Garfield High School AP Calculus Sisyphean effort. In other words, is it too laborious and too futile? And what I hear from too many, not tons of, but too many families, they say, well, it's just too hard to get into that tier 1 university, or it's too hard to get into, I hear this a lot. Naval Academy is just too hard. Why even bother? And I think to myself, for somebody that's got an attitude like that, I'm glad they're not going into the military, because I wouldn't want to go into battle with someone like that. So I think that, we need to help people see and this is getting to another point here. Here it is. We need to help them see that, where these expectations are taking them. There's a scene in Stand and Deliver, and Mr. Esconte's driving this beat up old Pontiac Trans Am or something, a sports car. And he's driving crazy, and he drives it almost up to, crashes it into a wall. And he tells his student who's in the passenger seat, he says, all you see is the turn. They could have turned right instead of going straight ahead into this wall. You don't see the road ahead. And I think sometimes we need to illuminate that path for students or for young people that were around. It's like, why do you do that? It's like with there's a young midshipman at the Naval Academy this year, and I told her in advance of going on her first day that there'll be things that they expect you to do, and you're not exactly sure why it is, but there's always a purpose for that. And so I think that in the military, sometimes we don't explain the purpose, but I think in general, in school, before kids get off to college or go to trade school or that sort of thing, we need to explain where these expectations are heading and taking them. And what I want to do here is this. This one scene chokes me up every time I see it. And this is when, the long story short is that these kids did so well from such a lousy school that there were more kids that passed the AP calculus exam in 1982 than any other school in California. And so the college board people, whoever run Scholastic Aptitude, people that run this test, they accused the kids of cheating. And so they had to take the test again. And there was a long period when this all happened. And so they got notification the afternoon before the retest, months later. So they only had a few hours to bone up on the test and take it again. And sure enough, they took it again. The scores came back. And what chokes me up a lot is that we heard all these 4s and 5s from kids in disadvantaged families, because Mr. Esconte really cared enough to push them and set high expectations. I think this is a movie that every family should watch. I really think so. So I guess now we have a couple minutes. What are our final takeaways?
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
I'm interested in the student who is quite privileged, who feels entitled to the college education and rides through it without much effort. And I know of one person who at a 50th reunion, when alumni were talking about their teachers and how wonderful they were, and this young man was reduced to tears publicly when he admitted that throughout his whole college career, he took the easiest courses, the gut courses, the rocks for jocks, as opposed to the geology course for people who are going to consider geology, even if you didn't. He was so despondent that he hadn't taken advantage of what privilege and some capability allowed him to do. And I remember other classmates saying, it's that you recognize that as a step to being able to do more in your career. I found that very moving.
What did he end up doing?
I don't remember. I don't remember. I think he found a job, but he felt like he had prevented himself, didn't allow himself to be challenged enough.
Well, didn't you have a classmate at the Naval Academy that was the typical football star and didn't have to, you know, didn't have to work as hard as some of the others, and he commented to you later in life that he wished that he had done that they hadn't given him, you know, the answers to the tests or whatever, that he, you know, that he
Yeah,
it would have that it would have been better if he had taken advantage of the educational opportunity.
yeah, he's a good friend, and he truly regretted it. He took the easy way, and I think that it's a regret that a lot of people have once they get a little later in life. Rich, you had something?
Yes. One of the other things that I saw, and I think all of us have seen this, you know, the people in high school that scored the highest and all, that it could inherently score well on a test, and when they get to college, they didn't have to really work. Everything came easy for them. But in my life, in having people work for me, those are the people that I didn't want to work for. The ones that had the perseverance and the drive, that would keep driving towards the answer and would get it, rather than saying, I can't get it. You know, the ones that were overly smart and all of that and didn't have to work and they just coasted through, versus the guy that had to work, spend extra hours persevering. That made all the difference in the world. And I think that's, in my mind, a huge factor, and in most cases untold or unappreciated factor.
Yeah, I think if you look at grit, work ethic,
Yeah.
self-reliance, those are the sorts of things that I look for when I look at Surface Academy candidates. Well, in wrapping up, I have a short reading list that I like. When our godson, when did you? I'm sorry. I have a overly sensitive microphone. By the way, I'll send this deck to everybody on the call. So for our godson's 16th birthday, we sent him a copy of Gifted Hands, because I thought it was such a powerful story about Ben Carson, you know, rejecting the fact that he came from a tough background. In fact, I think the fact that he came from such a underprivileged situation really allowed him to become great. Arthur Ashe, it still sits in my book stack. It is such an important read that that young people should do. Sammy Davis Jr., Yes I Can, Bill Russell, you know, young people are looking at, you know, sports heroes, and Helen Keller. You talk about the ultimate challenges in life, and she overcame those things. There are all sorts of other stories that we could challenge young people to read. The other thing, and we're 1 minute over, and I apologize, but I often ask young people a question. So what do you read? And they almost always recite something that they were assigned in class. And I tell the kids that are headed to tier 1 universities, tier 2 universities, service academies, I give them a reading list of $30. Happens to be my reading list. I you know, and not everybody would agree with it. But I say, pick one of those and just start and read one. And then when you're finished with that, read another. And maybe just only spend 30 or 45 minutes a day, and maybe before you go to bed, and just read something that's not something from the classroom. And that's another expectation, because kids these days, John, if you looked at some of the writing that I see coming out of high schools, it's not, it's inadequate. Mm-hmm. And the best way, I think, to become a better writer is to become a better reader. And so that's. So any final thoughts? Again, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your insights. And I think that we owe it to the people around us to help young people set stronger expectations for themselves.
What a great gift you were getting to the community, Bob.
Well, thank you for putting this deck together. It's amazing.
Yes.
I wish those links had worked, but It would have been interesting to see. We'll probably get your deck and be able to open the links on our computers.
I
But,
tested those links too.
Yeah.
That's the
yeah,
crazy
but you
thing.
didn't test it in Zoom, did you? That might have, Zoom adds a different layer to things sometimes that makes us unhappy. So, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Be
Bob.
well.
Thank you,
Okay.
Bob.
Okay. Good evening.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.